Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Learning to Unlearn, Han Feizi and Confucianism. When we introduced Han Feizi, we mentioned that according to the historian Sima Qian, he studied at the feet of Sun Tzu. This comes as quite a surprise, given that these so-called legalists, or Fa thinkers, are known as severe critics of Confucianism. Then again, it's not unheard of for philosophers to turn against their teachers. Just think of Aristotle refuting Plato's theory of forms, or Descartes rejecting what he had learned as a student of the Jesuits. Those same examples might make us wonder, though, whether the situation was more complicated. After all, Aristotle's writings are shot through with allusions to and borrowing from Plato, and it's often been pointed out that Descartes' Meditations uses the sort of scholastic arguments he would have studied under those Jesuits. Can we say the same about Han Fei, that he took over ideas from Sun Tzu and the Confucian tradition, even if he also distanced himself from that tradition? Yes, we can. An illuminating text would be the 9th chapter of the Sun Tzu, which begins by recommending promotion of the worthy and demotion of the unworthy, and goes on to say of the commoners, encourage them with accolades and rewards, and discipline them with punishments and penalties. Later in the chapter, Sun Tzu goes on at length about the proper responsibilities to be carried out by various officials. That all sounds quite legalist, and Han Fei would also agree with the closely connected point that loyal ministers can help stabilize and legitimate a regime, even if he is far more cynical about getting ministers to stay loyal. These points of agreement should encourage us to accept the historical connection asserted by Sima Qian, and to understand that connection as a genuine teacher-student relationship. This is actually not clear from Sima Qian's wording, since he says that Han Fei served Sun Tzu, which could mean a lot of things. He may have been trying to imply that Han Fei was exposed to Confucian philosophy, but not fully steeped in it, and did not become a real follower of Sun Tzu. This is what would emerge from a more careful reading of that same chapter in Sun Tzu. Though it does recommend the use of punishment and reward, Sun Tzu is convinced that these are tools that must be used skillfully by a virtuous ruler. Models, or standards, must be subject to debate and flexible application, and the central concept for Sun Tzu is not the standards, Fa, so beloved of Han Fei, but ritual. This is, in fact, the chapter of the Sun Tzu that includes the celebrated comparison between the political state and a boat. Just as the boat can be overturned by choppy water, so the state can be overthrown by a discontented people. Which brings Sun Tzu to enumerate 3 methods for avoiding political shipwreck: governing fairly and benevolently, exalting ritual, and rewarding those who are worthy and capable. Han Fei would have agreed with only the last of these 3. Yet Han Fei was still closer to Sun Tzu than the other Confucians. Certainly, he and the other Fa thinkers would have had no sympathy with the idealism of Meng Tzu, his talk of tending the tender sprouts of virtue that grow within all humans. As for Kong Tzu himself, some passages in the Analects seem to be rejecting Han Fei's thought in advance. This is especially true of a passage in the 2nd chapter, which reads, "If you try to guide the common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and will have no sense of shame. If, however, you guide them with virtue and keep them in line by means of ritual, the people will have a sense of shame and will rectify themselves." While other passages are more positive about the use of punishments in political life, in general, Kong Tzu seems to have thought that, in a flourishing state, punishments would be unnecessary. Not because the people would be cowed into terrified submission. Remember Shang Yang's motto that we rely on punishments to eradicate punishments, but because the ruler is virtuous, and virtue is infectious. Thus, in another passage of the Analects, Kong Tzu is asked whether it would be a good strategy to execute those who do not follow the Tao, and responds, "What need is there for executions? If you desire goodness, then the common people will be good." If the Confucians would find the Fa thinkers insufficiently moralistic and aspirational, the Fa thinkers found the Confucians naive, even foolish. Shang Yang clearly takes aim at their program of cultivation, when he says that excessive concern with poetry, ritual, and music distracts people from military activity, and thus weakens the state. And Han Fei develops an explicit argument against the Confucian theory that love for the people is constitutive of good political rule, which should be modeled on the love of parents for their children. He astutely observes that many children misbehave despite having affectionate parents, and that even the sage kings of old obviously didn't love their subjects the way parents love their children. If loving parents sometimes have unruly offspring, then how would a ruler keep his subjects in line by loving them but not quite as much? Tellingly, a few pages later in the same essay, Han Fei reworks the famous story about Honest Gong, who reported his father for stealing a sheep. Whereas Kongzi condemned this act of filial disloyalty, Han Fei says it just goes to show that a bad son may be a good citizen. The modern scholar Sung Moon Kim has argued that Han Fei's refutation of the Confucians is simplistic and unconvincing. Kim refers to another famous passage, the one in the Mengzi about the king who is encouraged to show compassion to his people instead of misdirecting his care to a trembling ox that is about to be sacrificed. Here, the king is being invited to draw an analogy. What if he were to apply feelings in the political domain like those he has in his private life? Similarly, the Confucians are not saying that the king should feel or act towards every citizen the way he feels and acts towards his own children. Rather, these two relationships are indeed different, yet analogous. We don't see the same rituals or responsibilities attached to rulership and fatherhood, but we do see that both kinds of relation are made harmonious through benevolence and care, aimed at the development of virtue. Well-raised children and well-governed people reciprocate this care by displaying loyalty and reverence. This would explain Kongzi's confidence that the sage king will hardly have any crimes to punish in his realm, any more than well-raised children would defy their fathers. Kim's defense suggests that Han Fei may have been rather superficial in his dismissal of the Confucian ideal of benevolent rule. Yet that very dismissal reveals a deeper rift between Confucianism and Han Fei's so-called legalism. Kongzi and his followers looked to great kings of the past as paragons of virtuous rule and sought to persuade the very flawed rulers of their day to imitate those paragons. As ministers, the Confucians themselves could serve as further models for imitation. Virtue would then flow from the top of society down to the lowliest peasants. For Shang Yang, Han Fei, and the other Fa thinkers, this was an unrealistic and ill-conceived project. Yes, an outstanding virtuous ruler or minister might come along once in a blue moon, but to build your political program around such men is hoping for the extraordinary to become ordinary. To make this point, Han Fei tells a story we mentioned way back in episode 7. The Confucian is like a farmer who sees a rabbit run into a tree stump where it can be collected for dinner, and from then on spends his days sitting and watching the tree stump for the next rabbit. Han Fei advises against waiting around for the next miraculously virtuous ruler. Being not so much cynical as realistic, he assumes that the average ruler is indeed average. Furthermore, this average man would have to exert his authority over sneaky ministers and a selfish populace. Where the Confucians predicted that such a situation would inevitably lead to political catastrophe, Han Fei believes that clearly stated and consistently applied standards can bring success even against such an unfavorable background. Thanks to the standards, the mediocre ruler does not have to make too many decisions, while the officials and people know they will be rewarded for helping the state and harshly punished for undermining it, and they'll act accordingly. As Han Fei puts it, with unflinching and amoral pragmatism, those who rule must employ measures that will be effective with the majority and discard those that will be effective with only a few. Therefore, they devote themselves not to virtue, but to fa. For Han Fei, the Confucian plan is impractical, and not just because it is intrinsically difficult or impossible to get most people to be virtuous most of the time. It's also because of the chaotic conditions of the Warring States period. Like Shang Yang, he believes that earlier times had been simpler, and earlier people easier to govern. When Kongzi implored Warring States rulers to imitate sage kings like Yao and Shun, he was being ridiculous. Not only were the mediocre rulers of the day never going to attain that standard, but the policies of Yao and Shun would not be right for the China of the Warring States period anyway. As Han Fei puts it, benevolence and righteousness served for ancient times, but no longer serve today. So I say that circumstances differ with the age. Again, this idea was prefigured by the earlier Shang Yang, who wrote that, to benefit the state, one need not imitate antiquity, and that, when the affairs of the world change, one should implement a different Tao. Likewise, the Han Feizi says that a ruler should not be timid in revising customary ways of ruling, because the supposedly tried and true methods will, in fact, often prolong the course of disorder. This skepticism about studying the past is well reflected by a passage found in Han Fei's comments on the Lao Tzu. He describes a scholarly traveler who hauls around a small library with him until he is told that the man who knows does not accumulate his wisdom in books. Instead, one should abandon the customs of former generations. Convinced, the traveler then sets his books on fire and starts to dance around the flames. This passage is bound to disturb us, given its obvious resonance with the book burnings said to have occurred during the Qin dynasty, to say nothing of such events closer to our own time. But for Han Fei, the anecdote illustrates what the Lao Tzu means when it speaks in typically paradoxical terms of learning to unlearn, or of its wordless teaching. The point could hardly be more anti-Confucian. The Wu officials devoted their entire lives to learning and imparting the lessons of traditional statecraft, ritual, music, and literature to anyone who would listen, all the better if the listener was in a position to wield power. The Fa thinkers rejected that whole strategy. Their worry was not about repeating mistakes of the past, but to the contrary, that previously successful tactics might be mistakes in the present. In support of this, Han Fei mentions King Yan, who came to grief precisely by imitating the virtuous and politically effective King Wen. As Eric Hutton has shown in a study of this and other historical anecdotes used in the Han Feizi, we do have here a sophisticated and daunting challenge to Confucian ethics, which, by extension, can apply to other forms of virtue ethics. Virtue ethicists tell us that the right thing to do in any circumstances is whatever a virtuous person would do. That sounds circular and uninformative, but it becomes substantive once we factor in the possibility of imitating the virtuous people we have the fortune to know, or at least know about. Thus, if I am a ruler asking myself whether to launch a war, I might consider whether Yao or Shun would launch a war when faced with the same situation. I could then turn to the historical record to help me decide that question. Against which Han Fei would make 2 points. First, the historical records available for these earlier times are patchy and unreliable. Indeed, he points out that it has become difficult in his day to reconstruct even the doctrines of the historical Kongzi. Second, and more profoundly, what might be right for an outstandingly virtuous ruler could be wrong for me. Yao or Shun might, for instance, win a war against steep odds, a war that I would be bound to lose, given my more modest leadership abilities. In much the same way, to use an example given by Hutton, a person given to overeating should not simply imitate a person with the virtue of moderation. The moderate person can allow themselves to graze at the buffet laid on at a party, whereas the glutton should stay in another room, preferably behind a locked door. So, as Han Fei says, what may lead to success for the excellent person could lead to disaster for the average person. To this, one might respond that virtue ethics doesn't recommend imitating the virtuous person in every detail. Thus, in the example just given, imitating the moderate person doesn't mean grazing at the buffet, it means finding a way to avoid overeating. But again, there are 2 problems with that response. First, it is one the Confucians would not be in a good position to endorse. The Analects lavishes extraordinary attention upon Kongzi's habits, recording how he ate, how he sat, even how he slept. So they do seem to have thought that one should imitate virtuous people down to the smallest detail, insofar as is possible. Perhaps this is precisely because they foresaw the second problem, which is that as soon as we start to abstract from the details of the virtuous person's actions, being told to imitate that person threatens once again to become uninformative or vacuous. The advice would go something like this. True, you shouldn't do exactly what the moderate person does at the buffet because you are an immoderate person, so that won't work for you. But you should imitate them by being moderate, and doing so in the way appropriate for you. But how are we to know what this means in practice without ourselves possessing the virtue of moderation? We're back to being told to be virtuous by doing whatever would be virtuous, which is hardly helpful. As Hutton admits, this is not necessarily an unanswerable line of criticism, but if there is an answer, it is far from obvious. Hutton does not explore possible avenues of response in his piece, but simply says that the virtue ethicist needs to find a middle path between encouraging exact imitation of the virtuous person on the one hand, and on the other hand, offering useless platitudes about being virtuous, whatever that might mean. If we ourselves were to suggest an answer on behalf of the Confucians, it might lie in the direction of exploiting a resource in their philosophy we have not much mentioned so far in this episode: ritual. After all, one thing that unites the correct behavior of the sage and of the normal person is that both are supposed to follow ritual practices correctly. The sage may do so with consummate skill and ease, but non-sages can at least do their best to go through the motions correctly. This provides a kind of additional guide, or we might say standard, alongside the comportment of the sages themselves. Putting it that way leads us to a final question, one that brings us back to the possibility of agreement between Han Feizi and his supposed teacher Xunzi. Isn't the talk of fa, or standards, in the Han Feizi actually a lot like the talk of li, or ritual, in the Xunzi? As we know, Xunzi even says that the sage kings devised ritual as a way of constraining and shaping the unruly behavior of the people, which sounds a lot like the function of fa in Han Fei and the other fa thinkers. Here we might recall the main reason to prefer the somewhat awkward phrase fa thinkers over the more usual term legalists, namely that fa does not mean only, or even primarily, law or penal law. It refers broadly to rules and standards, only some of which are laws. It could even be said that Xunzi was himself a fa thinker, a man who called for the application of standards, but his chosen standard was ritual. For him, in other words, fa and li are overlapping, if not synonymous. By contrast, Han Feizi's standards are not just the same as rituals. His examples of fa are all taken from the political and public sphere, not from the ethical and private sphere. And as we've seen numerous times, he lays great stress on the mutability and adaptability of fa. It is for each generation to develop new standards in response to changing circumstances, and the successful ruler, or perhaps minister, would be one who is capable of doing just that. By contrast, the Confucians upheld traditional practices and memorized the most minute details of those practices. Admittedly, this was not an absolute commitment on their part. Remember Kongzi's willingness to exchange a linen for a silk cap. But that's probably the exception that proves the rule, insofar as Kongzi had a good reason for the change. Silk would be less expensive, and insofar as Kongzi was a remarkable individual. It's doubtful that the Confucians would encourage us mere mortals to start tinkering with rituals in that way. In fact, Kongzi's ability to adapt ritual in line with his own perceptions of propriety gives us another contrast with the fa thinkers. While Han Fei does think that standards should evolve, he thinks that once the standards have been set by the ruler, they should be implemented without exception or alteration. In this sense, both traditions make place for particularism and context sensitivity, but at different levels. For Han Feizi, adaptability comes in at the level of deciding which standards to adopt, but once they are adopted, they must be rigorously applied. For the Confucians, the standards of ritual are received across the generations and not constantly reworked, but individual virtuous agents apply them in their own way, like artists improvising within a set framework. The upshot is that there are indeed resonances between Xunzi and Han Feizi, but disagreement seems significantly to outweigh agreement. Perhaps we might still tip the balance back in the other direction, though, if we consider what Han Fei would say about Xunzi's best-known philosophical thesis, that human nature is bad. As we know, this is a point on which Xunzi strongly disagreed with his fellow Confucian, Mengzi. Is it, in turn, a point of agreement between Xunzi and Han Feizi? If so, Xunzi might even form a kind of bridge between Confucianism and legalism. But is it really the case that Han Fei thinks human nature is intrinsically bad? Does he think that human nature is immutable, or would he allow that it can be altered through the application of standards? Among modern scholars, disagreement outweighs agreement on this very issue. Some think that Han Fei would follow Xunzi in condemning human nature as bad, while others think that, for him, human nature is morally neutral. Of course, no one would say he follows the more optimistic teaching of Mengzi, but the puzzle remains, and we ourselves are optimistic that you'll join us as we try to solve it next time, here on The History of Philosophy in China.